So we're going to get started now, everyone. I'm Kyle Cleveland with Temple University's Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies. We have with us today Mathieu Deflem, who is a professor of sociology at the University of South Carolina. His research and teaching interests include popular culture, law and social control, and social theory. He's done work on celebrity activism, has written on Lady Gaga, and this evening he's talking about pandemic politics and race-related activism in association with the tennis player Naomi Osaka. So he's visiting the country, and we're very proud and feel very fortunate for him to be able to lecture today. He will talk for 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. Okay, so Mathieu, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, thank you, Kyle, and thank you everybody for showing up. I'm glad that you could make it, obviously. I'm glad that we all could make it. And I'm indeed, you see the screen? Okay. And I'm indeed glad that I'm back in Japan again. Just briefly, by way of introduction, I was actually born and raised in Belgium. And then in 1992, I went to the United States, where I grew up, and got my Ph.D. In sociology at the University of Colorado. And I have since taught at Purdue University, Kenyon College, and for more than 20 years now at the University of South Carolina. If you want to know more about my connection to Japan, I will be happy to explain it to you. I've visited Japan for more than 10 years. And I've been married since almost 6.5 years to a Japanese national, unrelated to my initial visit. But obviously, I have visited Japan numerous times. And sadly, we haven't been able to visit for almost 4 years now. So it's our first time back. Because I'm not a Japanese national, I couldn't visit the country with COVID. And COVID, are we okay? And COVID is indeed the connection to this talk today, because very soon after the pandemic hit in the United States, which was basically in the spring of 2020, in March, the first week of March, I was still traveling. I don't know exactly how it was in Japan at the time. Maybe you already had COVID policies before. But in the first week of March, I was still traveling to Canada. But by the second week, it was clear that we couldn't travel at all anymore. And I didn't travel, not even in the United States, didn't take a plane. And I was stuck in my apartment for quite a while, actually. And maybe some of you were too. Stay home. I know Tokyo had a stay home, the governor of Tokyo had a stay home policy. And then the universities said, first of all, you have to keep teaching, which I thought was very offensive, because the universities should first have acknowledged that this was a very exceptional situation. But we all went online in our teaching, as I'm sure a lot of you experienced the same thing. And then the second thing that they did is they offered research money to study the pandemic. And I thought that was very cynical. It's like, hey, you can get money to study all this misery that is now going on and which is keeping you inside. But then I thought about it again. And then I thought, well, maybe I can study, a particular aspect of the pandemic that is related to my research interest. And in sociology, I basically have 2 lines of research. Most of my research, going back to my doctoral dissertation, is not related to the talk today, but is in the area of law, social control, policing, crime, deviance, those kind of issues. So I thought maybe I could do a study on the policing aspects of the pandemic, safety and security issues during the pandemic. And then I thought that that was a little bit too obvious. So I didn't study that. Obviously, it is related to some of the things I'm going to talk about next. And then I thought, why don't I do a study on the celebrity involvement in the pandemic? Because very early on during the pandemic, I'm going to assume that some of you were still in the United States during the pandemic. Is that correct? But some of you obviously Japanese, so you were not. So I'm going to give the talk in such a way that it will be understandable for all of you. But in the United States at the time, and I would say in Europe as well, there was a lot to do immediately from celebrity responses to the pandemic. And there was initially more in terms of the relief effort, and then gradually that turned towards activism. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Again, I do not have a particular personal connection to Naomi Osaka, other than, of course, that I knew her, not so much, I would say, I'm not entirely sure actually when I first heard about her, but it's probably not so much because she's Japanese as because she is a tennis player, because both my wife and I, we watch a lot of tennis. We particularly watch women's tennis. We sometimes go to the US Open even to attend events. There goes my PowerPoint. Well, now you're going to have to look at me. That's okay. And so then I started focusing at some point later in my research on celebrity activism on the role of Naomi Osaka. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'll talk about, I will situate this, first of all, in the celebrity culture that took place during and since the pandemic. And then if we look at what celebrities were doing, after a while, celebrities started to talk about activism, initially in terms of medical components of the pandemic, but then soon in terms of race. Particularly after May 25, 2020. Do some of you know what happened on May 25, 2020? Somebody died during a police arrest, George Floyd. You know who that is? Do all of you know who that is? Some of you apparently don't know who that is. If you had been living in the United States after May 25, 2020, you would all know who this is, because there was nothing else was discussed for quite a while. And that is when celebrities first started changing their activism from strictly pandemic-related issues having to do with the virus, with the coronavirus, focusing on racial justice. And indeed, Naomi Osaka was one of the people who was involved in this change of the discussion. And then since then, Naomi Osaka has focused more on mental health. That's probably not something I'll get to. First of all, there are three people that I think should also be just as famous as Osaka, and those are my collaborators, whose pictures you see here. See, we visualize, typically, when we talk about celebrity, we talk about people who are famous, but a celebrity is not just somebody like in Japan, like an idol, right? It's not just somebody who's famous, but it's also somebody who's well known for being well known. So they're kind of famous for their own fame. And so they can be famous even though you may not otherwise know who they are or exactly what they do. Like, for instance, in the United States, and I'm sure in Japan too, many more people will know Naomi Osaka without necessarily knowing her tennis. So she's famous for being a tennis player, and she can be successful as a tennis player, but as a celebrity, she is famous because people talk about her and people visualize her. So the manner in which I here kind of make an allusion to my own collaborators. There's 3 students working with me, where in the meantime, we're actually now on the 3rd funding cycle for this project. And it moved from first talking about COVID-related celebrity activities towards activism. And currently, actually, I'm doing more research on sports activism, but that's not the angle I'll talk about today. So I'm going to talk about what Naomi Osaka has been doing in terms of racial justice issues from the viewpoint of 3 different dimensions here. And the first thing is, you see, it's objective, subjective, intersubjective. I hope some of you see my approach is sociological, so maybe if not, some of you are not as familiar with it, I'll explain it in those terms. On the one hand is, what is it that she does? Right? So these are the objective actions that she takes. And actually, I can be fairly brief about it, because coinciding with the pandemic, what do most celebrities do to be celebrities? To be famous is they are online. They take advantage of social media. They are on Twitter. They are on Instagram, particularly Instagram, because Instagram allows you to visually represent an idea rather than with words. You know, today we live very much in a visual age. It's not an information age anymore. It used to be, you know, people talked about computers in terms of the information that could be sent out. like in the olden days, right? Before the year 2000, when everything was text-based. Nowadays, everything is based on Windows. Ever since Apple computers basically introduced Windows-operated computers, everything is much more visual. And that's why, for instance, online, there's quite strongly a shift from Twitter to Instagram. In the olden days, everybody was on Twitter saying what they had to say. Now they're much more on Instagram showing what it is that they have to say. And so that is one of the elements that was important during the pandemic. Why? Because during the pandemic, there were social distancing policies. You know, you couldn't meet people face to face. So as a result, teaching was done by Zoom, right, was done online. All interactions took place online, and celebrities were already exploiting those means of communication anyway. So that's actually a very interesting angle, that celebrities are experts at creating their own fame because they have a more privileged access to these means. So what is it that she does? A lot of online activity. Then it's subjective. What are her motives? Like, how does she herself rationalize what she does? You know, why does she do it? Both in terms of her motives, but also in terms of her objectives. What is it that she's trying to accomplish? And then finally, which sociologically is the most important dimension, is the intersubjective dimension, is how is that translated to an audience? So how does the audience perceive whatever it is that a famous person is doing? And indeed, I can kind of, you know, give it away, is that Naomi Osaka has in this sense been very successful. You know, she has been generally very positively perceived. She has gotten a lot of coverage, a lot of positive coverage, particularly in the media, but that also kind of went through the general public. And it is somewhat different in the United States and in Japan, and that's obviously something I'll talk about. So let me talk a little bit about what are some of those media. Well, that's kind of obvious. So you know these, you know, we don't have Line in the United States, right? In Japan, it's Line, I guess, right? But so Twitter is very popular. Instagram probably more popular these days. YouTube somewhat less, and Facebook also somewhat less. But what is also interesting is, so here you have the social media. So this is where celebrities and anybody else, of course, because I'm on Twitter too, but you know, you don't know that well. I'm not that famous, right? But you can look me up too. So I don't have really, you know, I don't have millions of followers, but celebrities here have very many followers. But it's also reported in the regular media. So in what we used to call the old media or the legacy media. So these are news stories. And what we actually found is, because initially I thought, well, this could be very complicated research, because if you would have to study all celebrities through all their social media, you would have an enormous amount of data. But it actually turns out that news media do a lot of reporting about these online media. So in other words, sometimes, or I would say even a lot of times, what you read in the news is that which you already know if you were on Twitter. So the news kind of repeats what is already done through these online communications. And then usually nowadays, in a lot of the American newspapers, which by the way are almost all online, there is very, very few paper media anymore in the United States, is that these via Google News you can look up, and all these online news stories will incorporate links to Facebook, Twitter, and so on and so forth. So this is how we did the research. This is methodologically very important, because during the pandemic, you couldn't talk to people face to face. See, so I had to rely on remote sources of information, but that is precisely where celebrity is established. So that was very much to our advantage. I'm only going to talk a little bit about sociology of celebrity culture, but what is important is this here. This graph, there's more theory behind it if you're interested in that, and that is that fame or celebrity is established in a relationship between the celebrity. So this is the famous person. Let's say this is Osaka on the one hand, and then you have her audience on the other. And the audience could be anybody. You know, so the audience, for instance, in the case of, let's say, a famous pop star, you could say, well, the audience, those are the fans. But that is not necessarily the case, because a lot of people know a pop star, but they may not be a fan at all. So the audience is potentially, well, unlimited, particularly because online media cross boundaries, so, you know, barring some linguistic barriers. And it is through the media that this relationship is established. And this is very important. You see, it's, as a sociologist, I'm always interested in the social dimensions. And it's like, how does the audience perceive whatever activities that take place from the viewpoint of the celebrity, the famous person, and how do they respond? Are they being reached? And then do they respond positively or negatively, which is particularly important, of course, if it is an activism issue, because by definition, activism means that you make an appeal, right? You want people to know something and you want them to respond in a particular way. So obviously it could backfire if you don't do it the right way. You know, like, who are you to talk about that kind of response? And there are examples of that. So some celebrities have been talking about some issues, and then people say, who are you to say that? You know, you're a celebrity. Why would we listen to you? But some celebrities have been very effective, and people have been very responsive to what it is that they did. And Osaka is one of them. So I'm interested in, why is Osaka successful in that sense? So not necessarily, it's still okay here? Yeah, not necessarily successful in, let's say, changing conditions of racial activism. That would be very far-fetched, of course, but successful in terms of reaching an audience and getting a generous reception. So again, it's like, what has she done? How is it motivated? And then how is it perceived? I hear somebody. Okay, cool. So first of all, COVID-19 was a catalyst in terms of activism. And first, so it started basically in March 2020, like I said before. What are some of the responses that celebrities were involved with at the time? One of the first things that they did is celebrities provided distraction. So instead of, you know, providing entertainment in the form of, let's say, a concert, you know, being outside, they would do at-home concerts. So you would have, it's like kind of like, instead of by Zoom, so instead of having a concert, you would have an at-home concert. Second, they would organize relief efforts. Actually, some of those concerts were done not to promote music, but to get money to organize relief. So to get money, for instance, for the first responders, you know, because the first responders, they had to be in contact with victims of COVID, with people who caught the coronavirus. And then this is actually one of the very first instances in the United States when celebrities were involved in responding to. You know who these are? Most of you don't know who these are? No? These are two very famous actors that none of you know who they are, but this is Tom Hanks. You know Tom Hanks? You don't recognize him? And his wife, she's also an actress. And what did they do? They posted the fact that they were tested positive. So they tested positive for the coronavirus, and then that in itself became a form of activism, because they said, you know, we got the virus, you know, don't be stupid like us, make sure, you know, you get protected. In those days, there were no vaccines yet, right? So you had to stay at home. Other relief efforts were this one. Do you know this one? Again, nobody knows. It's amazing. I'm talking about celebrity and none of you know who these people are. This is Gal Gadot, you know, Wonder Woman movie? No? Nobody? Some of you? Yeah. You see, again, so this is a famous Hollywood actress, very successful, and she did a song. She tried to comfort people, and she said, I'm going to do a song. And she, along with other actors, famous in the United States, you know, some of them crying, look how sad they are. They are suffering for you regular people. Look at them. See? And they would sing the song John Lennon. This backfired tremendously. People were laughing at them like, well, what is this? This is complete nonsense, you know, like it's like the celebrity is pretending to be like a regular person when obviously by definition, they are not regular people. So then you see some celebrities, what they did is it backfired. Other celebrities, and indeed Naomi Osaka is one of them, was very successful in what she did. And I'm going to give just an overview of everything that she did in this 1 year from May 2020 until May 2021. That is, it took about 1 year for Osaka to develop as a racial justice advocate. And it started, obviously, well, should I tell you a little bit about who she is? She has a Japanese mother and a Haitian father. Her mother is originally from Hokkaido region, actually, but she was born in Osaka. This is her father. This is her older sister. You know, Naomi Osaka has an older sister who was also a professional tennis player for a short while, but she in the meantime has retired, and she's now a fashion designer primarily. And then this is Naomi Osaka herself. So there you see her again. So she's the younger of two sisters who played tennis. Now, please tell me that you know two very famous sisters who played tennis, and they're American, and they're called Williams, and they're called Serena, right? And what's the other one? Venus? Yeah, do you know Serena and Venus Williams? So obviously, so they've been major stars, and this person was directly influenced by the success of the Williams sisters to have the same kind of professional tennis career for his two daughters, who are also, like the Williams sisters, Black for one, right? And obviously two young women. And so they moved in the United States. So they moved first to the United States, I think in New Jersey or New York in the Northeast, and then they moved to Florida to get the same kind of professional training. And then since 2013, Osaka is a professional. The first time she got into the news, or at least when she became, let's say, globally famous, she had already won, you know, and she had gone up in the ranking, was at the US, she won the US Open tournament in 2018. That's where you see a picture here. So at that time, it was still a little different the way she was received. At that time, I would say, Osaka was primarily received in the United States as a Japanese tennis player. And she was a Japanese tennis player who beat an American tennis player. But that has kind of changed now, because since later on, once she was kind of more accepted, these two women are seen as having something in common, namely their racial identity. See? So nowadays, it's it was a very strong shift. So nowadays, Osaka and Williams are both Black. Back then, it was more, you know, in the eyes. I mean, they obviously are what they are, right? So you see how sociologically it's all about how is it perceived? How do people look at it? And it was more like, this is the Japanese and this is the American. Also, this is the younger person and this is the veteran star. Then she was very successful, climbed up to the #1 ranking. So she won several major tournaments and she made a lot of money. She made most of that money, by the way, which is true for most very successful athletes, and also I would say musicians and so on. They make most of their money from endorsements. So they make a lot more money from, you know, sponsorship than they do from the tournaments themselves. And that is definitely the case for Osaka. Then this happened. Do you know what this is? So sadly, many of you don't seem to. Have you seen these images before? Just say no. Or some of you have, right? These at the time were extremely famous images. Well, actually, it was a videotape, right? So this is a picture of a videotape of the police making an arrest of a Black gentleman, obviously, and this is George Floyd. And these are just 3 shots. And it took, you know, famous like 9 minutes that he had his knee on, you know, the gentleman's neck, right? And then he later died when he was being, so the gentleman died, right? When he was being transported to the police to be arrested. And this is the famous May 25, 2020 videotape George Floyd incident. And that immediately led Osaka to respond along with other people, particularly, I mean, along with other people, obviously, but also along with other celebrities, particularly along with other sports celebrities. So part of the activism of Osaka has to do with her being a celebrity, a famous person. Another part has to do with the fact that she's an athlete, because it's typical in the United States that athletes, because a lot of athletes, not in all sports and definitely not in tennis, but a lot of athletes tend to have a lot of minority representation. So a lot of Black people, also Asian people and so on, depending on the sport, are visible in sports and therefore are also active in matters of racial justice. So it immediately led her to make a tweet. Most of the response to that was rather positive, immediately from the start. Then she wrote an op-ed in a famous magazine, in Esquire, and she says, you know, I see the horrific video, the torture of the hands of a cop in the street, my heart aches. So I decided it was time to speak up, right? See, so it's like, I'm not just going to play tennis anymore. It's not just about me being an athlete. I'm also a person. I'm also a Black woman and so on, as afterwards she will say very explicitly. There was another police shooting. There have been several incidents that, I mean, there are obviously quite a few incidents, you know. There are in the United States about 1,000 people killed by the police every year. I know it's only very few of them obviously get attention in the media, but whenever they do get attention, it leads to a lot of criticism. And there was another incident. So she says, you see, what does she say? Before I am an athlete, I am a Black woman. See, so she is very explicit about her racial identity. And that is also perceived that way. And obviously, you know, considering the times nowadays are much more positive for that. Then she comes out as an activist, particularly during this event. So this is the US Open of 2020. The US Open, I think, begins late August. Most of the tournament takes place in September. And what she did is she had the idea to wear the face mask, as some of you still wear now, and she took advantage of the face mask to use 7 names, and each name is the name of a victim of police violence. See here, George Floyd or other racially motivated violence. And she said she had 7 masks. And why 7? Because if you participate in the tournament and you win every match, then eventually the 7th match is the final. And indeed, so she played all 7 matches and she also won the tournament. So in that sense, she merged her athletic success with her statement on racial justice. And so this was a very high profile event, and it was in that sense also very successful. So like I say here, this got a lot of media attention. This was all over the news. I mean, almost every day there was an article about Naomi Osaka in the news in these days. And it was also generally very positive. She writes a second op-ed. So she writes a second op-ed, this time in the New York Times, you know, probably the most famous newspaper in the United States. She very strongly continues this identification in terms of her racial status. And by the end of the year, she's very successful, both athletically and also in terms of reception of the audience, and she wins awards. What is interesting about these awards is that she receives the award both for her athletic achievements and for her status as an activist. So that is quite a turnaround from the earlier days. Maybe, well, no, I almost said maybe some of you remember, I cannot say that. In the late 1960s, maybe, have you ever seen an image of 2 Black American athletes on the podium of the Olympic Games? You know, what is it, gold, silver, bronze? Right, gold, silver, bronze, and you see them on the podium, and 2 Black American athletes raise a fist up like this. So they raised the fist up. This was in 68 in Mexico, I believe, right? Raised the fist up in protest of racial injustices in the United States. They received a tremendous backlash. Those people couldn't get a job if they, you know what I mean? So they got a very, very negative stigma. Nowadays, it's very, very different. If you are athletically successful and famous and given certain other conditions, you can look, now you're on the cover of Sports Illustrated. And the sports person of the year is not actually only Osaka, but this is one cover, but the sports person of the year is the activist athlete. So athletes as activists is a very well-received notion. She basically then, from 2020 onwards, she returns to tennis. There's a little bit of activism still going on. This is when this Derek Chauvin is one of the police officers and he was found guilty. So she was okay with that, but that's about it. Sportswoman of the Year, see? So the Sportswoman of the Year award that she won here, she demonstrated, what does it say? Incredible activism and support for the Black Lives Matter movement. So you see, it's like they don't even mention her being a tennis player. So the activism is the first reason, maybe even the only reason, why she gets the reward. But then what happens is the following, and this is kind of where it ends, where the overview ends. This is a year later. So this is exactly a year, well, obviously, after the killing of George Floyd, is the 1-year anniversary. And what do you have on because the pandemic is still going on, you see? So the pandemic is still going on. So there's still a lot, the vaccines are getting to be available, but people are still generally very careful. And there's a lot of demonstrations going on to commemorate this 1-year anniversary. But what does Osaka do? She doesn't talk about it anymore. See? So she suddenly kind of ends her activism on racial justice. And instead, what she tweets is this here. And this is an image that she tweeted on the day that George Floyd had been killed just 1 year prior. And what it is, it's a shot of her. And she actually, I fell on my aha hat twice today. So she's kind of making a funny little video. And it's her at the French Open. And that is obviously very interesting. So first of all, there's no more racial justice activism. And then what happens the next day, May 26th, she says, I'm not going to participate in the press conferences. Why? Because, you know, the journalists ask a lot of questions. And whenever the journalists are asking a lot of questions, they don't have any regard for athletes' mental health. And that became the next issue for Osaka. I don't know if there's a lot to do about mental health issues in Japan, but there is in the United States. And again, it becomes an issue of activism for celebrities, for athletes who face particular pressures. And that has been then the next issue that Osaka has been talking about. So from May 2020, until May 2020 until May 2021, it was all racial justice activism. And then from May 21 throughout May 2022, it's all been mental health activism. And as you know, maybe, do you know Osaka currently is not playing because she is pregnant? You know that? No? Okay, cool, very cool, very good. I'm talking about a celebrity that nobody knows. This is really good. This is the way it happens, right? So it's 2 years ago and, you know, now she's kind of gone. And it's true, you know, she's a much less in the spotlight as a result. But what is interesting actually is that in that next 1 year, she moves radically from racial justice to mental health, and she's again very successful in that. So there's a lot to do about mental health in the United States, and she has had a lot of role in that. So we can talk about that some other time. So if I would analyze this, there's a number of issues that are, so that was just an overview. So if we look at what are some of the sociologically relevant issues involved here, so think again what I said before, right? So we know what she's done, because basically what has she done in terms of racial justice? Well, she has stated her opinion. You know what I mean? She hasn't, like, you know, given money to change the situation. You know, she hasn't become a politician, right? She could become a politician. Say, you know, vote for me, and then when I am the next prime minister of Japan, then, you know, I'm going to change things. She hasn't done that. She stated her opinion. She stated her opinion. She was very vocal about these issues. And she said, you know, then I, as a Black woman, can communicate that to the audience that knows me. And she is in tennis, and tennis is a majority white sport. You know, if you go to a tennis match, almost the entire audience is white. You know, tennis is somewhat actually even, it's not even ordinarily white. It is a somewhat exclusive sport. You know, regular people don't go to a tennis match. You know what I mean? You have to have quite a little bit of money. You know, it's a little bit of specialty sport. So she said, I, as a Black woman, can communicate that to an audience that otherwise wouldn't know much about it. So she identifies strongly as a Black woman athlete. She is both Japanese and American. So she kind of identified, she said at some point, she said, people sometimes wonder, what am I? And then she says, I am all those things at the same time, right? So she kind of doesn't want to exclude any dimension of herself. And then what is the point is to raise awareness, see? So the point is to make people start thinking, to make sure that they know what it is that we're talking about, what some people are dealing with, and then hopefully that will lead to a more to institutional change and organizational change. So at the same time, she is also very successful in tennis, both athletically and then as well financially. This is actually, I'm not going to talk about it today, but if you're interested in it, in terms of her mental health, it's the exact opposite. So from 2020 to 2021, she was always talking about racial justice, and she was always winning. And from 21 to 22, she was always talking about mental health, and she was always losing. Because you see, if you lose, you can talk about mental health, because it shows that you have pressures, you know, like it shows that you cannot always, you know, participate at the highest level. And in fact, Osaka has sometimes been very successful in her mental health activism precisely because she refused to play. She said, I cannot participate. I will not participate. So you kind of purposely take yourself out of the game. So the favorable conditions obviously have to do with the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that there was a lot of activism going on. Most of it has by now disappeared. I also talk a little bit, if you're interested in this, do you know Colin Kaepernick? My guess is you do not. Colin Kaepernick was, I should say, a professional football player. So you probably know in the United States, football, I think, is probably the most successful sport. Football and basketball, I assume. Football, basketball, baseball. I think football is the single most successful sport in terms of the amount of money that is generated. And Colin Kaepernick was a quarterback, so he was a player. He is Black, and he was one of the first critics of police violence, and it led to a rather negative perception, you know. So then he got taken off from the team for athletic reasons. But then he says, of course, it's not just for athletic reasons, but he got taken off the team. And at that time, people weren't very receptive to Kaepernick, but that has changed a lot. There's actually research being conducted on this by media analysts. And in this day and age, in the post-Kaepernick era, sports activism is generally rather favorably embraced. So this attention that she gets is both for her tennis and her activism. I already talked about that. Yes, what is interesting is that sometimes the discussion is about activism, even when that's not the original focus of the attention. And nowadays, that is the same thing for mental health. So it's like Osaka doesn't even have to talk about racial justice. The media will talk about racial justice just as soon as Osaka does something. So as soon as she was athletically successful, then the media would again pick up on the racial justice matter. Most of it concerns policing. That is kind of obvious. Well, it's not obvious. But in this day and age, a lot of discussions in the United States about racial justice have to do with police violence. It's not obvious because For instance, in the 1960s and 70s, a lot of racial justice issues had to do with political mobilization. You know, in some states, Black people were disenfranchised, so they couldn't even participate in voting. So then it became political mobilization. In the 70s and 80s, it became economic mobilization. So then it was all about racial minorities should have the same economic opportunities as white people. Nowadays, a lot of racial justice has to do with what is referred to as racist violence. You know, the extent to which Black people would be subjected more to police violence than whites and so on. And indeed, Osaka does that too. So she talks about police violence in terms of racism, sometimes in very strong terms. Like here is a quote where she refers to the continued genocide of Blacks. You see, the continued, you cannot get a stronger term than that, of course, right? You know, so it would be like deliberately being focused on minorities. She has global appeal. This is at least the case. This is actually a quote. She has appeal in every continent because tennis is being played all over the world. Like in every part of the world, there's tennis. In very few parts of the world, there is baseball, although the United States and Japan are two of those countries, right? But like I grew up in Europe, I had never seen baseball. I didn't even know what baseball was, you know what I mean? And then, so it's in the United States and Europe. Tennis is everywhere. But at the same time, does that mean that her appeal is global? That is quite different, I would say, because at least the potential is there for her to have an appeal that is global. But I think that national cultures have a lot to do with how that activism is perceived. So maybe, yeah, I still have 10 minutes about? 5 minutes? Okay, then let me end with this. Is about, what about the reception of Osaka in Japan? Actually, the reception of Osaka in Japan is not very good, judging from this audience, right? See, so most of you don't even seem to know quite well that she's been doing these things. And to the extent that you would know, and indeed to the extent that it is known in Japan, the reception is not quite always as positive. Actually, I would say sometimes there seems to be a somewhat positive response. Usually, I would say it is not quite as positive, and at least is ambivalent. And so, first of all, the condition is very different. So this is something that I'm very interested in, but I'm interested, obviously, from the viewpoint of what you, for instance, would have to say, because you would know it much, much better than me. But generally, famous people in Japan are not activists, right? There are some exceptions, like I read an article just this year, published this year by some Japanese scholars, and it was about the extent to which athletes and famous people are involved in social issues, but it tends to be very limited. For instance, after the tsunami, you know, like relief efforts having to do with a natural disaster, then it kind of seems to be something that affects all Japanese people. So then there can be a role for celebrities. But when it's about political issues, racial issues, you know, it would be quite different. So the response to Osaka in Japan, I would say, is primarily because of her athletic skill. Like, you know, she's the first Japanese person to win one of the major tournaments. She's obviously the most famous tennis player from Japan, other than Kei Nishikori. Do you know him? Yeah, maybe man, right? But so among women athletes, she's definitely the most famous. But at the same time, as you can see, Osaka is rather optimistic about it, because she said, you know, this racial justice movement, not her activism, but the movement has gone global. So it has gone from Oslo, what does she say? From Oslo to Osaka, from Tallahassee to Tokyo. She said there were even Black Lives Matter marches in Japan. Did you know there were Black Lives Matter marches in Japan? I didn't know it either. No, I don't think there will have been a lot. I've seen a report about one such march, and it had about 1,000 people. That is very small, you know, because the marches in the United States were all over the place. Some even led to riots, and they were very well attended. So there is some response in Japan, but I would say by and large, it is ambivalent and sometimes even negative. Like here's a statement that I read, I think it was either on Facebook or on Instagram. So when she said, when Osaka came out about racial justice and as a Black woman, and then somebody immediately said, well, I guess she's not Japanese after all. See, like it seemed to have made her more American. And to the extent that the Japanese news and also the people in general, I would say, are more receptive towards her activism, it is more seen as, yeah, in terms of American problems. See, so the worldwide respect that is made, that is referred to here in this media article, to me, this really goes to show how successful she is in her activism, because I think that objectively, this is not true. You know, she is not celebrated as an activist worldwide in a strict sense, you know, so it is much stronger in the United States than it is in Japan and probably also in other countries. But it goes to show how, you know, how successful she is. So here you see, for instance, Black Lives Matter in here in Japan. So it got some attention, but not that much. This is probably something that got a little bit more attention. Actually, I would say this is more indicative of the general Japanese response. There was a video by Nike, and it talked about racial justice situations in schools, and it actually was negatively received. So it was like, what are you talking about? Those kind of problems, isn't that American? So there was immediately a backlash against that. Then there's also this. This is actually from before the pandemic. Have you seen this? No? But apparently this represents Naomi Osaka. And so obviously Naomi Osaka said, I don't quite look like that, right? See, so you see, so it is difficult, I would say, in, you know, are you either Japanese or not? So this obviously has to do with the status of biracial people in Japan. And sometimes, you know, people will say, oh, things are changing, but I don't think they're quite, you know, changing as much as maybe some other people would hope they would, you know. So she reacted to this quite negatively. So you see, celebrities are doing a lot. The last thing that I'm going to talk about is, you see, again, look, Naomi Osaka could save lives. Now, this is very successful activism, you know. You're a tennis player, and all you do is talk about an issue, and people say that you could save lives. That is, you know, this is about as, that's what people say, you know what I mean? Or that's what the media say. So that's about as positive as it can get. To end it, I'm going to talk a little bit about celebritization of race, and particularly about the research that I want to do next. So then you see some of the issues. This is what we refer to as celebrification. And celebrification is becoming a celebrity, right? So you're not well known, and then you become well known, and then you become a celebrity. Like, do you know Kylie Jenner? Any of you know who that is? Some of you? Do you know Kim Kardashian? No, these are some, I'm very happy that you don't know who these people are, because they have no fame of any kind that is based on any achievement. So they're just famous for being celebrity and for posing with pictures and for being beautiful and for, you know, using Instagram filters and so on and so forth. But they are very, very strong as celebrities. But at some point they were not known at all. Then they become well known. Osaka becomes well known first because she is a tennis player, and then second, because she's an activist, and she's on the cover of Time magazine. And this person is also on the cover of Time magazine. And this person is the health person in the government. So this is a member of the American government, you could say, I forgot, CDC or something, right? His position, and he's an expert on the coronavirus. So an expert on the, so he's a scientist. And nobody really knew who he was. But then because of the COVID virus, he is also on the cover of the magazine. And then we have celebritization. Celebritization means that something can become a matter to be discussed in celebrity culture. Look, this is the celebritization of a virus. Because you see, there was a couple in India, and they had twins, and they called their twins COVID and Corona. So in other words, the virus is celebritized. The virus itself is becoming, you know, famous, so to speak. Second, you have another example, the vaccines. So here it's like a celebritization of, you know, the response to the virus. That's this one. This is, somebody who says, don't vaccine shame me, because, celebrities were saying, you should get a vaccine, and then some celebrities refused to do it, and so on. I take responsibility. These are people who are apologizing for being white. Have you heard of that? That's what they do. They apologize for being white, and they are very white, but they're also very rich and very affluent. And look, they're very serious. They wear glasses. You see, if I didn't wear glasses, you wouldn't believe a word I say. You see, you would say, he's not a real professor, but now I am. See, see, this woman now wears glasses, and they very sad, and they do like this. You see, this is like in Christianity. So there's a religious reference. So race and activism becomes celebritized, and that is obviously also what you have with Naomi Osaka in terms of racial justice. Okay, I'm going to leave it at this because I'm running out of time. Well, thank you very much. Arigato gozaimasu.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. So everyone, if you would like to come up here and speak, that would be great. Our court is not quite long enough to be able to pass it to you. So you could ask the question, I can repeat it. Or if you would prefer, you could come up here and ask directly. Do we have any questions from the audience? I'll give the people who are giving in online, they didn't hear. So I'll get the students from my class who come here today, the first opportunity. Does anyone have any questions?
Otherwise, I would say, otherwise, just yell the question now, then I'll repeat it. And then, yeah. So the question is, do I see any dangers from celebrity activism? Let's put it this way. I would think it is foolish to see anything a priori, to see anything good coming from celebrities, right? So let us not kid ourselves about what celebrity really is, after all, right? Because, well, what is but then if you want to talk concretely about one of the dangers. So let me first say, I do not primarily approach it that way, right? So let's say as a sociologist, I'm interested in studying what I see and making sense of what I see. But suppose, for instance, that I was a racial justice advocate, right? So suppose that I'm really concerned about racial justice issues, and that somebody then would ask me, there's a celebrity who would like to join your cause, so to speak. What do you think about that? What would I then, having studied this, have to say? And I would say, be careful what you wish for. And that is going then to those dangers. And the first one is this, is that there is, by definition, a contradiction or a tension between a celebrity talking about any activism issue, and that is, whatever issue it is that you're talking about, most people who are confronted with this issue are not celebrities. So you understand what I'm saying? So by definition, even if you are Black, you are not Black in the same sense the way other people are Black. You know what I mean? Although you may even have come from conditions that are very similar and that are maybe in some sense very negative. So that obviously applies, let's say, for instance, a famous football player in the United States, right? So a very famous, very talented, very rich football player can be Black, and they literally grew up in poverty, right? Nonetheless, most Black people in poverty don't become very rich. See, so they lack that mobility. So as soon as you become a celebrity, you're drawn out of this community of, let's say, regular people like you and me, So that is the first problem. And so that is what we refer to sociologically by the term, by the term privilege. But it's not like white privilege, but there are different kinds of privilege involved with being a celebrity. So the most obvious one is economic privilege. But most celebrities are wealthy, but the other ones are very important too, and that is what we call normative privilege. So for instance, celebrities, when they are in trouble, just like generally people who are fortunate, when they are in trouble, they have access to certain means that most ordinary people don't have. So a tennis player, right? Surely, Naomi Osaka, I'm sure she has been discriminated against. at some time. I'm sure there were people when she grew up that said, oh, you're just a black girl. I'm sure she has, but it's not quite the same as ordinary people who cannot rely on a support system, for instance, or who cannot say, like, for instance, if she has mental health struggles, she also has access to mental care professionals. She has access to an entire support team. So that, I would say, is the basic danger of celebrity activism, is that celebrities, by definition, are not they're not one of us. They will who said that very early on in the pandemic? There was a very famous person who you really should know, a singer, who said the pandemic is the great equalizer, and it was Madonna. You know Madonna? Please tell me you know Madonna, right? And Madonna posted a picture on Instagram sitting in a bathtub with flowers in the water, saying the pandemic is the great equalizer. That's very strange. You see, I don't sit in the bathtub with the flowers. You know what I'm saying? And I don't put that online. So by definition, she really shows that it was not the great equalizer, And the second, so that's also the case with Osaka. And the second danger is, which I actually told you, is in May 2021, it stops. That is that celebrity activism tends to be very temporary. It's not their work. Their work is to play tennis. I'm not saying they should only play tennis, but typically celebrity activism is only temporary. And obviously racial justice issues are not temporary at all. They're very permanent, so they're very long lasting. Yeah. Anybody else?
Can I raise a question?
Sure.
The question I have regards the point you made that I found to be very interesting at the very beginning, or at least in your abstract, that you said, I don't know if you're implying that it's more about celebrity than it is about race in some ways, that she is known for her involvement in this, but not necessarily just for the racist thing. And then the other related question I have is, what's the dynamic where she comes out as an activist and then withdraws and talks about a mental health issue? There's kind of a reframing of the issue.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to understand why she would withdraw at the time when she's getting the highest amount of attention.
Right. Well, she doesn't withdraw from activism. So she doesn't withdraw from activism, but she changes the direction of her activism from racial justice to mental health. Now, it is very difficult for me, of course, to say what motivated her and whether or not her motives are genuine. I typically, the question then is one of what we call the authenticity of activism. That is this. Suppose I'm a celebrity and I talk about racial justice and I say, I'm fighting for the people. Then you might question me and say, maybe he's just doing that to be in the spotlight. Maybe he hasn't been selling, enough concert tickets. Maybe she is losing, right? Naomi Osaka is losing. So you may question my motives. But I would say that doesn't really matter, because authenticity is typically something that, as a sociologist, I assume that Osaka is sincere. I assume that she really means what she says and that she is genuine in that respect. So when she changes from racial justice to mental health, I can only make the observation that she's doing it, that she's therefore terminating, right, which is that one danger, terminating one program and beginning another one. I would personally actually say that her confrontation with mental health is probably more directly related to her than is the racial justice. Because after all, because there's a very interesting thing, actually. I have another paper about that has not been published yet, and that is about her mental health activism. And the interesting thing is this, that Osaka was almost immediately received as central to mental health activism without having done any activism at all. all she said is, I have mental health problems. That's all she said. Literally 2 tweets. She said, I will not participate in the press conference because the journalists don't have concern for mental health. And then she withdrew from the tournament. She said, I'm not going to play because I've had bouts of depression and I have anxiety. And immediately, the media and the general public said, she's a mental health activist. But she hasn't done, strictly speaking, it was, and I call it unmotivated activism. So you are called an activist, but she had not done anything. And then she became an activist. And there's actually interesting research on that in sociology, which actually goes back to something altogether different. To it is like, you can define yourself as something, not because you make that decision, but because you respond to the environment. You know, it's like in sociology of deviance, this is a very traditional problem that is, you know, I do something, like I take money. Why? Because I want money. You want money, I want money, we all want money. But I take money, so I'm a thief, correct? You call me a thief. I didn't call myself. And then you say, he's a bad boy. Right? He's bad boy. And then I say, oh, really? Oh, good. I'll be bad boy. So for now, and then you call yourself that. So it's called secondary deviance. See? So I respond to the environment and I'm like, oh, I didn't, well, okay, I'll be that. And that's what you have with Osaka too. So the activism of Osaka in terms of mental health is in response to the environment. And that is because, well, there's a number of factors on that. But I would say it has a lot to do with mental health culture in the United States today. Is there more to do about that in Japan these days? I don't know. But I think there is. Sometimes I hear things, you know, but it's not as openly discussed. You see, this is a big difference between the United States and Japan, and actually generally, right? I'm generalizing, sociologists always generalize, and also between American people and Japanese people. Japanese people don't talk about a lot of personal issues. Americans talk about every conceivable personal issue all the time, every time, all the time. You can meet an American person, right? Don't you see that with students maybe? I don't know. It would be interesting to study it. You can meet an American and 5 minutes later, you know a lot of personal details about it, right? True? It's true. And that it also takes place at a social level, at a cultural level. And so nowadays, everybody likes to talk about mental health. To the point, I would say it is a celebritization of mental health. And people think that you have a problem if you don't tell us that you have a problem. You understand what I'm saying? Like, oh, I have problems. I have a lot of problems. Oh, me too. I feel, anxiety. Yeah, me too. Sometimes I can't sleep at night. Oh, I got that too. You see, so there's a lot of discussion on mental health. And like mental health is the new black. You know that the new black? It's like, it refers to, it's a fashion term. But like I see in Japan, a lot of people wear black. I wear a lot of black, not today. See, so black is a color, so people call it the new black. It's like, you know, the little black dress and all that stuff. And so during the talk, at some point I showed you a slide, it's like black is the new black, like race is the new black. And nowadays I would say mental health is the new black. Young people do it too. Young people talk about suicide, talk about depression. Everything is depression. When I was young, that didn't exist. I would just say, I worry sometimes. Depression seems such a medical term, and now everybody. And so I think that is what Osaka is stepping into. And I can only assume that she is sincere in, you know, in what she says. And other than that, I don't want to speculate on her personal motives. Let's put it that way. But it's very popular, very popular. And yeah, athletes, of course, have these issues, right? Because athletes have to perform, you know, like I know, of course, like in Japan, sometimes it's high performing people in industry and in business, and then they face certain problems. That is sometimes discussed, right? But that's about it. Yeah, in the United States, everything is discussed. Okay, anybody else? Yeah.
I literally use the bullet pulpit here. Is anyone?
So the gentleman asked a question about the differences between Japan and the United States in terms of celebrity activism, right? And why is it so differently perceived? Now, you should know that, so this talk is based on basically on two publications that I already have. I'll show you. If you just go online, you see here, you see some of my relevant publications, including a forthcoming one with my co-authors. But if you just Google my name, all my work is online. See, so all my articles, just Google my name and you'll find, and I post copies of it. And basically the talk I gave today is drawn from two publications, one on racial justice activism and then one on Naomi Osaka, and I drew from both. My stay in Japan is precisely to begin research to address the question that you asked. So I am here in Japan because obviously, given my linguistic limitations, right, to put it mildly, I am, not. Also, I think you would really have to be a Japanese scholar, or at least a scholar in Japan, not necessarily ethnically Japanese, but in Japan, to study that issue and then to kind of compare with what I've been doing. And that's why I'm here in Japan, because I'm here for 3 months for my sabbatical research. And I'm collaborating with two people at University of Tokyo to address that issue. And partly, we're actually interested in two things. One is a legal dimension, that is the normative framing of celebrities. You see, celebrities are people with a lot of money. And people with a lot of money are also people who are confronted with lawsuits, because other people want that money, because they say, you didn't write that song, I wrote that song, you should give me money, see? So you have a legal response, you have litigation involving, and sometimes there's litigation involving Japanese companies, because obviously there's a big Japanese music industry. Copyright protections are very strong in Japan. I know it actually because Kyle, Professor Cleveland, he actually said, who copyrighted that picture? You know, the picture that is on the poster for this talk. So Professor Cleveland wanted to make sure that that picture was in the public domain, and otherwise he has to mention the copyright, because in Japan, Japanese legal system, copyright protections are very strict. You know, illegal music downloading and so on could get you into some trouble, right? In the United States, it's pretty, because when you asked me the question, I thought, oh, right, because it's so Japanese of him to ask that, you know, because in the United States, I don't care, I just take pictures, I put them online, you know, I don't even worry about it, see? So that's one thing. So that has to do with litigation. But then the other thing has to do with this, and that is the extent to which celebrity activism in Japan is even possible. It hardly exists. Is it even possible? And will there be a similar drift towards activism as has been witnessed in the United States and in Europe too, you know? Oh, and it's not just Osaka, and it's every celebrity, every famous person has an advocacy. So at this point, I would say activism has become a product of any celebrity. So, you know, you should go to Wikipedia, right? Go to Wikipedia and look up the name of a famous person. And very often, one of the subheadings is activism, foundation, advocacy, or it will say, you know, Lady Gaga is an American singer and activist. Naomi Osaka is a tennis player and activist. So they will even be defined like that. And so I think in the Japanese context, that is quite different. So, you know, it has to do with culture, right? It has to do with so much with how this entire case is embedded. You know, like today, I didn't just, let's say, I didn't just talk about Osaka. You know, I didn't talk about one person. I talked about the success of one person in a cultural context. So it has a lot to do with that environment, right? Sociologically, you always think about the person in an environment and how that environment enables something or how it disallows something. You know, your environment gives you certain opportunities, but it also gives you certain limitations, certain restraints. And so the cultural context, you know, and sometimes people will say, oh, we have some of that in Japan. You know, but it's so minor compared to what it is in the United States. And I don't think that that is going to change anytime soon. I personally also don't hope that that will change. I don't have a problem with cultures being different. You know what I mean? Cultures are different. Cultures have their own dynamics, and it's, very difficult to learn from one to another, but it's very interesting to compare. And the last thing I want to say about that is the following, is that at the same time as it is true that Japan and the United States are very different countries, they are also very closely linked. There's a military American presence in this country, which goes back to the 1940s, obviously. To some extent, there are a lot of American things in Japan, right? But there are also a lot of Japanese things in the United States. Japan has had a revival. It's kind of going to the end now, but since about 20, you're American too, right? You will know it too. Well, since about the last 20, 30 years, maybe even, there is more Japanese popular culture in the United States, mainly through anime and so on. There's that convention. There was a convention. Is it an anime convention in New York? So you can go to it's huge, and then the Japanese consulate is there, and there is this huge convention, and all you see is Japan, all you see is Japanese, but all the people that participate in it are Americans, and they dress up, they do cosplaying and all that stuff. So there is Japanese music. It's nowadays it's all K-pop, right? But okay, but there's quite some J-pop, and I saw Yoshiki in New York, so I like ex-Japan, and the other day we were talking. Oh, my husband, he likes Bandmate. I said, oh yeah, I know Bandmate. It's an all-girl Japanese group. See, so there is, but it's not quite the same. But what I'm getting at is this: although the cultures are very different, they are also interlinked more than they were before. So that obviously means that it is nowadays, and then through the internet, it is nowadays more possible that there are these changes taking place in different countries that you can no longer say where it originated. That is real globalization. It's what we call globalization. So that things take place in different countries without necessarily being imported and exported the way it traditionally was.
One of the questions that I wanted to raise was, you've done work on Lady Gaga, and I assume that overlaps to some extent. In comparison, because we're associating Naomi Osaka with racial activism, would Lady Gaga be something of a gender rights or kind of gender fluidity, LGBTQ kind of activism? Is that the dynamic? How would you make those comparisons between these two different modes of celebrity?
Yeah, well, that is exactly the answer, of course, because indeed, in terms of, I'll show you a little bit if you're interested in this. Let's see if we can get to that. This is Lady Gaga in Japan. Do you know Lady Gaga? Good. So she is world famous, right? This is a Lady Gaga concert in 2012 at Saitama Super Arena. This was the first time I was in Japan, because I came to Japan to see the Lady Gaga concert and to give guest lectures about Lady Gaga and her fame. And this is a picture that I took of the Little Monsters. Do you know what Little Monsters is? Yeah, the fans of Lady Gaga are referred to as Little Monsters. Yeah, with the sign, very good. See, with the monster claw like this, very cool. See, and then this is a picture that I took of some fans. And what do you see? So the question is about the activism of Lady Gaga in comparison to Naomi Osaka. Indeed, Lady Gaga cannot talk about race. And she didn't talk about race. And it would be quite silly for her to talk about race. She's white, she's Italian American, but that's about it. But she talked a lot about gender issues and about LGBT issues, sexual orientation, sexual identification, everything to do with young people. And it actually has a lot to do with her own position in the music world, because indeed Lady Gaga initially became famous in the gay community, the gay dance scene. And Lady Gaga would always say, thanks to my gay fans, they made me popular, they made me famous. And that was my initial fan base. And you can also see this here reflected, because this, do you know this flag? It's a rainbow pride flag. You see this in Japan? Do you see it in Japan? Yeah, it's used. It's you know what it is, right? But it's very commonly used. It's a global sign. So here you see the fans. So very much identify. And then here you see it even clearer. See, this is actually a friend of ours. We shall meet later. And this is, so you see, thank you, Lady Gaga, for, you know, supporting the LGBT community, fighting for, is there, can gay people get married in Japan? No, I don't know. No, they cannot. So there's no marriage equality in Japan now. So there is in the United States. Of course, then when they changed the laws, it was actually a Supreme Court decision that basically legalized gay marriage in the United States. Then Lady Gaga tweeted and she said, "We did it." I don't know if she really did it, you know what I mean? But that is activism. We did it. But she definitely was part of the conversation and part of changing the culture. And so here you see, you know, so it's a woman who obviously identifies as LGBT, and she says, you know, in the fight for marriage equality. I don't know if it's really the case that is, you know, so to answer the question, there is a logical connection between Lady Gaga and, let's say, gay issues and generally issues to do with sexual orientation with young people. The one issue, do you know, there was one activism cause that at least her fans told me gained her a lot of sympathy in Japan. That was after the tsunami. You know, so after the tsunami, Gaga did established, you know, basically she donated money to Japan. She donated money to Japan. She would also talk about it. She was also, in those days, it's a little while ago by now, right? But in those days, Gaga was in Japan a lot. She was on like Smop and stuff. She was on all these television shows. She did a lot of interviews. And fans told me that there was a lot of positive energy towards Lady Gaga because of the concern that she showed towards, you know, the people of Japan and a particular issue about Japan.
I have a couple of questions. Are there any other celebrities that you've been researching? And how does this track on your larger research project?
Yeah, actually, yes, there are. Actually, that is one of the research projects that I'm currently engaged in. So along with Brandy Brunson, who is obviously a young Black woman, because I felt, you see, I also felt that I was not ideally placed to study this issue, right? Because who am I to study Black women athletes? So I was very fortunate, a very smart student I have. Brandy Brunson was also interested in race and gender issues. And with her, we are now doing a study on Black women athletes. So because there is a very interesting change in that respect, and that is that activism among athletes dates back quite a long time. Like I said, in the late 60s, right? But it was rather negatively received. Then basically during the 1980s and 1990s, Black athletes withdrew from activism. So they were no longer activists because they said, let's be successful at sport and set the example. Because you see, you can say, I, as a Black man, and the leading example was Michael Jordan. You know Michael Jordan? You know, so he was at the time, you know, the best athlete in the world, not just the best basketball player in the world, the best athlete in the world, one of the richest athletes in the world, extremely successful, extremely positive image. He didn't say a word about any activist issue. And the reason was strategic. He said, I'm going to be successful. And by being successful, I set the example. And people will say, oh, look, a Black person can be very successful, you know? So it's like your positive image without explicitly addressing it. That changed That changed after the 1990s. So let's say over the last 20 years, when you again had Black athletes speaking up about issues. People like LeBron James, you know LeBron James, he is currently a famous basketball player, Colin Kaepernick. So you had, again, Black athletes speaking out, particularly about racial injustice in the United States. But what was particular about that initial wave of athletes is that they were all men. So in other words, you know, you have an intersection, you know, we talk about intersectionality nowadays, that is like Osaka. Osaka is not just Black, she's also Japanese, right? She lives in the right? See, and then she's not older, she's younger, she doesn't play in a majority Black sport, she plays in a majority white sport. You see all these different intersect, and she's a woman, she's not a man. And what is very striking is that over the past 5 years, almost all athletes who gained a lot of attention are Black women, young women. So they are both young and they're women, and that is new, and that's what we're studying. So another example, actually, some of you may know about this because the Olympic Games were in Tokyo, right? So 2020 in 21, right? Were the Tokyo Olympic Games, and there were some of those issues were being discussed, like Simone Biles. You know Simone Biles, she is a gymnast, right? Like she's a gymnast, and she also has talked about issues of mental health and activism in general. And in the United States, a good example are the WNBA, that is the women's basketball. There is professional women's basketball. They talk about issues. I myself, I'm a professor at the University of South Carolina. In the United States, college athletics is a very big thing, like it's huge, right? You know, like the football team, there's tens of thousands of spectators. And I happen to be at the University of South Carolina, where the Gamecocks, the women's basketball is the #1 team in the country. So hopefully they're going to win the national championship. Most basketball players are Black, young Black women, and they are also very vocal. So what is interesting about sports activism is that it comes from minorities, you know, predominantly Black. It crosses, so it crosses the gender barrier from men to women. And the third issue is that some of it is not about celebrities at all, because it also is sports at the college level and even sports at the high school level. So you have athletes that are activists that are not famous at all. So it goes away from the celebrity level altogether. So it's a very broad phenomenon. I'm going to give you only one because it relates to what was asked before about the danger. So obviously I'm still studying that, but so far one striking similarity that we saw, that we think to see, it's a little bit provisional, between celebrity activism and sports activism is that it comes and goes. So even among Black athletes, it seems to have a certain, well, fashion thing, you know, it has a trend. So it is not always as durable as you might think it would be, because after all, they are not celebrities. Okay? Very good.
Matthew, all the way from South Carolina. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Really good. So
Okay.
Thank you so much. I think
Thank you.
this was really great. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.